Hello and welcome to the first ever Mammal Society Ask the Expert session. I'm Zeb Soanes and I've been patron of the Mammal Society for just over a year now. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we asked you to send in your questions for our panel of experts. Now, I know among those questions, we've had a couple which are fox related, which I may pitch into a little later. But to answer your questions, we have Penny Lewns, who is one of the first ecological consultants in the UK. Her specialism is the ecological impact assessments and protected species surveys, particularly for badgers, bats and dormice. The Mammal Society Chair and Professor of Environmental Biology at the University of Sussex, Fiona Mathews, and Fiona's work investigates the profound effect that changes to the environment can have on wildlife and human populations. Derek Crawley, who is an independent assessor and verifier, and in his spare time studies mammals. He's founded and chairs the Staffordshire Mammal Group and coordinates the National Mammal Atlas Programme. And Dawn Scott is Head of Life Sciences at Keele University, and Dawn has an interest in urban mammals, particularly interested in observing how urban foxes coexist with humans. So welcome to all of us this evening. We're going to get straight on with the questions. Question one is from Sophie Lunn in Derbyshire. And Sophie says, I want to gain some clarity on a single female badger that I've surveyed near my home. Is it more common for urban badgers to live alone? She seems to be using an outlier sett, but as her permanent residence, she's also in good health, and I've been watching her for over a year now. Also, how long do urban badgers tend to use an outlier sett normally? So who'd like to pick up on that?
Okay, I can have a go at answering that one. Okay, so to be able to understand urban badgers, we need to understand rural badgers as well. So in a rural environment, the badgers live in a main sett, and there's outlier setts, lots of different types of setts. And those setts can have 30 different badgers. So in a rural environment, badgers tend to be in quite a big group and they defend that territory. So they all help to defend the territory. So we would say they were sort of social, but they do forage on their own. So if we look at an urban environment, so urban badgers are really trying to hang on, and the number of setts is really restricted by the space they have. So in an urban area, you might have sort of very small patches of rough ground where they can get their setts. And so the setts tend to be a lot smaller. The badger group is a lot smaller as well. So we only have about 5 to 8 badgers living in a clan. And they tend to use some of the outlier setts because it's part of the wider complex. Now, there's some studies that say that urban badgers don't use those outlier setts as much, but we found that they shift a lot. And this is because of disturbance. So the main sett could possibly have times where there's disturbance, and the badgers are having to sort of move around to other areas to sort of hang on to that territory. So we've also got a single urban badger in our back garden at the moment, and I think that they've moved in because it's the breeding season. So in a sett, in the different holes and spaces underground, badgers like to keep their own space. They tend to like their own territories, even underground. And when females are breeding, they get very defensive. They don't like any other badgers coming close to their cubs until those cubs are sort of a bit more independent. So in those cases, when they're breeding, sometimes the female badger can chase off other badgers. And so the maybe non-breeding badgers, maybe some of the subadult males, some of the older animals get ousted out of the main sett temporarily while that female's breeding. So how long they stay there depends on what's happening at the main sett. It depends on the condition of that badger and the social interaction with that badger. But in urban environments, they don't really need to be that social because they're not as territorial, because the territories are a lot smaller and they've got very good resources. So I think that answers the question. She shouldn't be there for that long, but it really depends on what other sett space is available and her relationship with the other members of the clan.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dawn. Question 2 is about stoats and weasels, and Penny and Derek, I think perhaps you're best placed to answer this one. It's from Nick Martin in the West Midlands. And Nick says, apart from tail and general body size, is there a way of differentiating between a stoat and a weasel. I already know the well-known ones about the third difference at the margin of brown and white, off-white, but is there a way of telling from head shape or nose, ears, eyes, etc.? I would love to know, as so often my views and photos have the key features obscured. So Penny and Derek, what have you got to say to Nick?
Well, Nick, I know exactly what you mean, because it is very difficult. The difference in size between a stoat and weasel, there is a difference in size, but the largest weasel and the smallest stoat overlap in size, so that, you know, purely on size it can be really difficult, and especially as they're so fast and, you know, you just get a fleeting glimpse. I would say that there is, you know, weasels are often slightly darker and stoats slightly sandier brown. Maybe the ears are a bit more pricky-uppy. But I would say it's a really difficult call. Derek, have you got any thoughts? I would say I often, you know, sort of, I look at it and I have to double take myself until I can see a tail or something really conclusive.
It is extremely difficult to see them in the field because of those quick views. But on the whole, weasels tend to have a little bit more pointy face, where stoats have a slightly more rounded nose. But again, on a quick glimpse, it's very difficult. Some of the easiest ways to do it is to actually try and see these animals as much as possible. And for that, I tend to cheat. I tend to go to some of the UK zoos and therefore see them a lot more frequently than I do in the wild. And therefore, I get a better idea of their general jizz, their general characteristic as they move. Other than that, it's just a case of perseverance. And of course,
yes, sorry, the only.
And it's also going back to that white bib, with the fact that the stoat has a straight edge with the rest of the body, and the weasel has that indefined border, which is unique to each weasel.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to say is, in the West Midlands, you may not be so lucky, but in the winter, of course, your stoats will go white if you're a bit further north. And then it's much easier.
Question 3 is one for Dawn and Derek, I think, and it's from Jill Cardy in Wiltshire. And Jill asks, do foxes kill and eat hedgehogs, or have they just been scared off? How do I get my hedgehogs back? I fear that putting out hedgehog food will just attract the fox, but I suppose I could build a fox-proof feeding station. I'd like to know how you go about building a fox-proof feeding station. So Dawn and Derek, what have you got? What advice?
I was going to say that there's quite a few examples on Facebook at the moment of people who have got fox-proof feeding stations. So they tend to put out a box with a long tunnel that stops foxes and even cats going down to get the food from inside. So there's good advice for hedgehogs on Facebook and on many of the hedgehog rescue groups as well. Unfortunately, from those rescue groups, we do know that foxes will attack and eat hedgehogs. Because a lot of hedgehogs don't actually roll up into balls when approached these days, quite often dogs and foxes actually manage to grab hold of a back leg, and a lot of the hedgehog rescuers report injuries that way.
Can I bring in Fiona briefly? Fiona, does this chime in with what you were telling me about the changes in hedgehog behaviour?
Yeah, so as Derek said, it seems that hedgehogs not only are becoming more and more urbanised, but they also seem less and less willing to roll up at an instant, which does make them more vulnerable. But of course, hedgehog foxes also have the clever trick of peeing on hedgehogs as well to get them to unroll, which I imagine, if you were finding yourself peed on by a fox, you might unroll as well. Yeah, the wily old fox, eh?
So are there any other advice on how to attract hedgehogs back into the garden?
Can I come in on that? So we've obviously done studies looking at hedgehog and fox interactions. We've collected lots of videos from the general public to look at foxes and hedgehogs. And actually, although hedgehogs can be potentially predated by foxes, and we have seen some interactions where foxes have actually moved hedgehogs away from the food to get to the food. So rather than attack them and eat them, it's been more competitive. We had about 150 videos, and in none of those videos did we see a fox actually kill and eat a hedgehog. Most of the time they were just eating with the hedgehog. The hedgehog does tend to sort of roll up a bit and move away, but the foxes in that case weren't predatory. So I think it's quite localized and patchy, and I don't think it always happens when you have a fox and a hedgehog together that the fox will eat the hedgehog. In an urban environment, there's loads of other food for foxes. You know, there's lots of people put things out. A hedgehog's quite a hard thing to tackle compared to just chicken and lots and lots of things that people put out. So there's been a study done where hedgehogs actually avoid areas where there's badgers due to scent, but it's not been shown directly with foxes. And we've seen on camera traps where foxes, hedgehogs and badgers in the same garden, sometimes all at the same time. So we haven't seen that avoidance, although there has been some evidence that hedgehogs do avoid badger smells. I will leave it to Fiona about gardens, because I know she likes advising people on what to do gardens for hedgehogs.
Fiona.
Yeah, so I mean, as Dawn says, one of the interesting things in the urban environment is there's so much other stuff around for hedgehogs, foxes and badgers to eat, so their interactions might be quite different. In your average back garden, the sort of thing that is really encourage your hedgehogs, other than putting food out, is actually to create spaces where hedgehogs like to be. So that's places where they can nest, so either putting out an artificial house for the hedgehog to go in, or more naturally just creating piles of leaves that you swept up in the autumn, not being too tidy with your clippings and stuff like that, chuck them in a heap. And I've certainly come across hedgehogs hibernating in winter in my garden when I'm having a poke around there. And also just lay off the pesticides. We'll think about pests being bad for bees. Well, they are bad. Bees are also bad for all the little creepy crawlies that hedgehogs like to be eating. And frankly, it just drives me wild when I go to a supermarket and see rows and rows of pesticides for sale. And you just think, really? I don't think we actually need those back gardens. If we're really worried about something like a hedgehog, then making those first steps at home. Stop being so tidy and let the creepy crawl back, and then your mammals will come back too.
Well, Fiona, we've got another question about hedgehogs from Michael Goff in West Sussex. And Michael asks, is there any evidence that urban hedgehog populations are adversely influenced by competition with rats, brown rats? Hedgehog sightings declined and eventually ceased altogether in my suburban garden a couple of years ago, following the arrival of rats, which quickly learned that food was put out at night and started to arrive earlier than the hedgehogs. Do these species compete for other natural food sources? Would rats predate juvenile hogs or hibernating adults? So there's quite a few questions there, Fiona. Can you answer?
It was a really interesting question. One that there's very little evidence about, to be honest. And if you think about it, rats probably are one of our most frequently sighted animals, and yet they're also one of the animals that we know least about. They're not native to Britain, and we know that they will predate a whole range of things, from birds' eggs. They'll take small mammals, they'll clearly eat rubbish. So we really have very little grasp of their grasp of what they're doing to mammals just in a normal back garden situation or in the wider countryside. Most studies on rats are things like on predation on seabirds in offshore islands and things like that, where there's really concentrated efforts to get rid of them. Whereas rats are probably pretty much ubiquitous across Britain, though bizarrely we have only very shaky estimates of how many there are. There may be around 7 million rats, but the number could be very much smaller, or it could be enormously higher. And really there've been no systematic surveys done to know how many rats there are. So it's quite hard actually. Derek, do you want to come in?
I was just going to say that there have been records of rats actually eating hibernating hedgehogs. They actually chew through the spines on the back. And that's been reported to me on a couple of occasions. Other than that, they probably would predate on juvenile hedgehogs. and if the numbers do get up, it's there. And the other thing about rats at the moment is they're becoming a lot bolder, because a lot of their food sources of us living in a throwaway society isn't happening quite so much. So that I've had a lot of reports of rats being much more visible in people's gardens.
The other thing,
Dawn, you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, I just wanted to share an anecdote actually, because it's really funny. So when we were doing our camera trapping studies, looking at interactions between different animals in an urban environment, we had fantastic footage of a hedgehog going across a garden, and a rat came sort of behind it and actually landed on it, and then it shot up into the air. So although you know, there is the potential there in terms of competition, the rat definitely ended up worse off when it tried to even come into contact with this hedgehog.
We'll come on to foxes a little bit later, but I've noticed maybe this is the same reason that rats are visible during the day, but because all the restaurants and the pubs are closed, I'm seeing a lot more bold foxes during daylight hours. I don't know if that's something that you've noticed, Dawn, as well.
Yeah, we've had lots of reports of this. So actually we're collecting information at the moment on a study looking at the reports of foxes. So because they're so adaptable and they can be active day and night, they really respond very, very quickly to human activity, which means that as soon as there's nobody about, they will detect that and they will start to be more active. So they're incredibly flexible. I think there's a question later about adaptability of foxes, but it's not becoming bolder, because bolder is a characteristic that tends to be innate and learnt. What it is they're not being disturbed. So it's about the human disturbance level means that they can go about doing what they would usually do without being scared off, rather than actually be bolder as a characteristic.
Well, let's stick with hedgehogs just for one more question. Oh, sorry.
Before we move on,
Yeah.
I just wanted to make one more point, which is about rat control. And if people are in their garden, please be very careful about how you deploy rat control, particularly poisons, because of course they're made to be very palatable, which is why rats like to go and eat them. And of course, rats and hedgehogs are not terribly dissimilar in size, and so hedgehogs will try and investigate the same sort of things. So you need to just think very carefully about where you're going to position bait stations and things, if you're, or alternatively use an old-fashioned snap trap or something if you need to control rats.
Thanks, Fiona. Question 5, staying with hedgehogs. Ellen from Shropshire would like to know, what signs around the garden tell me that a hedgehog lives there?
Okay, well, here's a great thing to be doing in the lockdown. How about, Blue Peter style, make a footprint tunnel for hedgehogs? Okay, so the idea is that you make somewhere nice that a hedgehog would like to walk through. So what you're after is a triangular shaped tunnel, and this one here is made of corrugated plastic, but you could make it. So you just need a bit one A4 paper and a little longer than 2 sheets of A4 paper. And what you do is you put your piece of paper down inside the tunnel, and right in the middle, what you do is you want to put out a paste of ink that's going to give you your nice footprints. And you can make that yourself from a combination of either black powder paint or black charcoal, which you can, amazing what you can get on the internet. People use it for cleaning their teeth. So get some charcoal powder, mix it 1-to-1 with some vegetable oil, and it makes a little paste, and you paste that in the middle. And then next to that, you want to put some food. Either you could use cat food, dog food, proprietary hedgehog food, or tinned sausages. They really like hamburger sausages, which are a bit more easy to handle. And you know, they'll be left when the shops are clear of every other sort of food, they'll still be there. And you put it out. It works best if you put it up against a hedgerow or a wall or fence, somewhere likely to trundle along, with nice clear entrances at both sides. You have a piece of paper at the front, your dye in the middle, then your food, then some more of the ink, then another piece of paper. And hopefully what you'll end up with is something like the image on the right, with lots of little hedgehog footprints You can see they're pretty distinctive shape, and other small mammals will tend to just produce little tiny, much lighter dots. The other culprits that you sometimes get in there are foxes, not foxes, cats will try and squeeze through, but fortunately their prints are quite recognisable. And if you go to our website, Mammal Society website, you can find resources there showing you exactly what a hedgehog footprint looks like. Basically, they're in old-fashioned money, they're a little bit, about an inch long and a little bit more than an inch wide. It's about 2.5 centimetres by 2.8 centimetres. You can also, of course, look for poo, less glamorously.
I want to explain that. Derek, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on from Fiona and say that on screen you can actually see the footprints of hedgehogs, but also mice going across the page as well. There are lots of different animals that use these tunnels, and it's very useful to actually find out what's in your garden. A nice fun thing to do if you haven't got a wildlife camera.
Well, and a great thing to do with children during lockdown as well.
Yeah, yeah, it is fun. And sometimes I'm even entertained by slug and snail slimes going through and see they've been through and gone out the other side. They often nibble the paper as well, bizarrely. Yeah, other than that, you can, of course, look on a trail camera if you're lucky enough to have one, or look for poo. Which is pretty distinctive. I think we're going to have another poo conversation in a minute, so maybe we can talk some more about poo later.
Well, I've not had my supper yet, so I look forward to that. Question 6 takes us back to foxes, and this question comes from Belgium, from Richard Hardwick. And Richard wants to know about the adaptability of foxes and whether there are any published studies on the phenomenon. He wonders if adaptability is an inherited trait, so that urban foxes have been selected for behavioural adaptability and are more adaptable than feral. And the reason he asks is that a fox regularly visits him and comes into the kitchen and eats out of his hand. And he says, seeing most people around here would shout and scream if a fox tried to come into their house. How did it come to have this behaviour? Was it watching and copying from parents, or was it somehow already genetically predisposed to keep trying different addresses that smelt good? So Dawn, I think that's probably for you.
Okay, so to be able to understand behaviour, we need to understand that behaviour is complex in terms of that it's partly innate and partly learnt, and that proportion depends on the animal. So in terms of adaptability, we're talking about evolution to a point that animal has got a different ability to learn things and be able to cope in different environments. Now, foxes are a generalist, so they can eat more or less anything. They are what we call opportunists, so they're very good at exploiting anything that comes along. And that means they are very intelligent, and they're intelligent because they have to solve problems. If they're going to try and work out what they can eat, how they can eat, that generalist behaviour tends to be quite intelligent. They have to be good at problem solving. So in an urban environment, it's suggested that there's more problems to solve and they could be potentially more intelligent. We've tried to actually study this to see if urban foxes are better at solving problems than rural foxes, and the data doesn't really come out very well that there's a clear difference. And the reason for that is that foxes are highly variable in their personalities. And when we talk about personality, we talk about certain traits, and this is where the genetic comes in. So we recently had a litter of fox cubs that had been rescued, and we followed their behaviours and their personalities. And in all of those different 7 litters, there was some fox cubs that were very bold, and some foxes that were very shy. So this is the same litter, but they're very variable in terms of personality. So coming back to this question, why would you have a fox come into somebody's house? What affects that fox? And do all foxes do that? No, they don't. So first of all, it will be based on innate. So it's personality trait that it's been born with. So whether it's slightly bolder or slightly shyer. Now that can change over time, but when we've looked at our litter of cubs, that personality tends to be quite stable from a very young cub all the way through to sort of development. We looked about 12 weeks. Those ones that were dominant, those ones that were bold, tended to stay quite bold. So that tends to be an indication of innate. And then we have the learned. So when foxes are starting to develop and explore, they will be brought back food by their mother, so they'll learn what to eat. And we tend to find that in an urban environment, urban foxes exploit things that they've been exposed to when they're quite young. But then as they start to develop and explore, that's where the learning comes in. So with this fox, what's probably happened is that as it's exploring, developing, trying to find out what's edible, it's come across somebody that has left out food. And then it has that association, that people and food. And that fox is likely to be slightly bolder to make that jump to go towards people in the first place. So why a fox would go there is a combination of the bold personality, the learning opportunities in that environment, and then having that experience, and that experience then being reinforced for it to do that. And foxes are very good at learning which houses are where they get fed and where they don't. So this develops over time, and they don't always get it right. But they'll probably go back to the house and the association of that person, and then avoid the houses where they don't get that same experience. They don't get the food, or they get shouted at. So I think that answers the question. But I think the main point is foxes are hugely variable in personality. They're all very different, and you can't generalize to a single fox, but they are amazing at adaptability.
I found with the foxes that visit me, with Gaspar, the main fox that I had an experience with, Gaspar's cubs. Gaspar brought the cubs with her, and only one of those cubs from that litter of 5 foxes then continued to visit of his own accord for another 2 years afterwards, but the other cubs didn't. So that would suggest that it is on a fox by fox basis, and that it isn't just generally kind of passed on.
Yeah, the fox cubs, so there's a period of time where they follow the mother, so they start to become more and more independent, and there's a few weeks where they'll follow the mother through the territory and work out where food is. It doesn't take long after that she starts to sort of push them aside, and then they start to temporarily avoid each other. But there is a period of time where she basically introduces them to the territory and to food sources. And those ones that learn and stay in the territory are likely to then come back. Some will disperse and some will die. So of your 5 in the litter, quite a few of them probably will have died. Some of them may have dispersed, and then one of them has probably inherited the territory from the mother.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you, Richard, for your question from Belgium. Now, Derek, we've talked about poo, and as your Twitter handle is Poo Finder, you're probably best qualified to answer question 7. Apologies if, like me, you haven't eaten yet. Now, Rebecca has sent us this photo, which she would like identified. She simply asks, who is dropping this? Derek, do you have any ideas?
Well, as you say, I am a poo finder, and most of us are. One of the things that all mammalogists seem to do is pick up poo. And on this occasion, that's really what we need to do. The picture itself isn't too clear, it's quite dried out. And what I think all of us would want to do is pick it up, maybe add a little bit of water to try and get the smell back in and give it a good old sniff, and then actually look to see what it contains. It does seem to have some form of bone in there, and possibly ends of feather, which would suggest some sort of carnivore. The fork helps if we can work out how big a fork is. I think we've all run to our drawers to check just how big our forks are, to try and work out which carnivore it might be.
And Derek, that very thin, pale, is that what you're referring to as the bone? Because it looks slightly worm-like coming out of the top of it.
I'm not too certain what that thing coming and stuff, whether that's part of the actual dropping or not is hard to say. Sometimes some of the mucus does come out when they deposit. Now, the bones are the little lighter sections within what we're assuming is fur, with the rest of the actual dropping that's there. Penny, have you got any thoughts on this?
I agree. I mean, size-wise, you are actually looking potentially at one of the small mustelids, at a stoat or a weasel, maybe. Probably, contents-wise, given the number of bones that have been crunched up, maybe stoat. If I'm going to put my neck out. If it was by the water, of course, you'd want to have a good sniff and see if it smelt very pleasant, like jasmine tea, and then you'd go otter.
Yeah, but trying to work out what a stoat and weasel smell like is difficult. Polecat is a possibility, and they're fairly foul. Not very clear at all. And again, if it's water and it smells very rank, it tends to be mink. So you can see, Zeb, it's really about sniffing this stuff rather than getting pictures.
Yes, thank you, Zeb.
I think once they develop the the scratch and sniff that you might get in magazines for perfume, then I think a book on mammal droppings will be soon to follow.
I think that will be a bestseller. We've just got time for one last question, and this we'll start with Penny, and then ask everybody. If you had to pick one thing for gardeners to make their gardens more mammal friendly, Penny, what would it be?
Oh, I think for gardening, where I see most mammals in my garden is in my compost heap. So it's where all of those small bugs and beasts that the small mammals like shrews feed on. And I often get really good sightings of shrews in my compost heap.
I once worked in a theatre before I worked for the BBC, and it was near a river, and there was a whole family of shrews that used to run along the footlights, nose to tail. It was the most extraordinarily cute.
Oh, brilliant.
Right past the lights in the footlights. It was incredible. Dawn, what would you do to make a garden more mammal friendly?
So I always say give your garden wild space, and so try to leave things wild, try not to clear up too much, wood piles, tall grass, lots of sort of just leave the gardening in some areas and just let that create lots of natural resources. If you leave your space for wildlife will come.
Derek?
I'm probably going to pinch Fiona's and say don't use the pesticides and the herbicides. The more wildlife that's in there already, then there's more food for the mammals, including the bats. So the more insects that we encourage, because we have more flowers, the better it is. Whether they be what we tend to call weeds, but are in fact just wildflowers that have lots of nectar, then that's what I would suggest. No pesticides.
Fiona, does that leave anything for you?
Oh, okay. I'm going to go with dig a pond. There you go. You're locked down. What else are you going to do? Dig a pond. Because although we think of that as being good for amphibians, actually it's good for all sorts of things. And not only do mammals come and drink there, but if you think about bats, for example, they'll be really attracted to all the invertebrates that emerge from ponds. Yeah, dig a pond. Why not?
And I would just say, don't be too neat. Just leave rough areas. Recently in the news we've been talking about leaving Mohicans in the middle of your lawns. But my favourite gardens in London, friends' gardens, have always been the ones which are the wildest, where you just mow a little patch for you to sit in and let everything else go wild. And so that would be my tip. That's all we've got time for. Sadly, we will be doing another one of these Q&As sometime soon. So thank you to all our experts this evening, to Penny, to Dawn, to Derek, to Fiona, and to all of you for sending in your questions. If we didn't get to your question, don't despair. You can send in more for a future Q&A to info@themammalsociety.org, info@themammalsociety.org. And if you'd like to find out more about Britain's mammals, please visit the website www.mammal.org.uk. Now, from all of us and from me, enjoy the rest of your evening and do please keep safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.